Andy Warhol's preferred term for orgasm was organza. And in part, only in part, and I probably can't go into the detail of it right now, but in part that explains my choice of the cover image for my book, forthcoming from Duke in January of next year. Janek Delorier is a French-Canadian sculptor who's made a whole series of life-scale objects, here obviously a typewriter, but elsewhere even an army tank, out of very soft sort of ephemeral fabrics, and the typewriter is primarily comprised of organza. Warhol's leapfrog from lumpen, spasmodic medical orgasm to frothy, pretty dress-up organza reminds me that across the years of reading for my Orgasmology project, my own eye has grown skittish, accustomed to being snagged not only on the word orgasm, but also on any of its typographical near misses: organism, organic, once even Klaus Ogerman, potentially, but never in actuality, organza. Evincing more than the usual allegiance of the scholar for her object, my momentarily succouring attraction to these words that have even some passing morphological resemblance is a reading strategy subliminally developed in the absence of a field of anything like orgasm studies. I'm not complaining about the absence of such a field, still less am I proposing to inaugurate one, but I do note that my scanning misrecognition of orgasms others is an effect of the fact that with very few exceptions, orgasm has seldom been the object of sustained scholarly attention in the field of sexuality studies in which I work. Reading for orgasm reminds me newly of what it was like to read for homosexuality as an undergraduate in the mid-1980s, before lesbian gay studies or queer theory had emerged as a coherent research field. Far from there being nothing written on the subject, it is rather that the many scholarly references are dispersed and unsustained, seldom substantial enough to have a presence in anything as orienting as a title, a table of contents, or an index. Under these circumstances, reading becomes more like tracking, some untrained sense of vigilance sharpening in the vicinity of certain words, drifts of thought or mental association, in anticipation of their revelation of a concealed figure. Undisciplined by any tradition or field of scholarship, orgasm has been for me a volatile and unstable basis for a research project. During this research, I've been alternately hobbled and energised by an awareness, sometimes even an apprehension, of the aura of oddness that descends to claim those who take orgasm seriously, who invest sustained time or energy in thinking about orgasm, those Dylan Thomas has unkindly described as intellectual muckpots leaning on a theory, post-surrealists and orgasmists, tit-in-the-night whistlers. However reasonable and plausible the motivation at onset, it seems there is always the risk that an orgasm-centred project will run amok, its author marked down in the historical record as a crackpot. Take Marie Bonaparte, for example, analysed by Sigmund Freud in the 1920s, and later to make influential contributions to psychoanalytic theorisations of the acquisition of femininity. Bonaparte's lifelong pursuit of vaginal orgasm, which included repeated and unsuccessful surgical modification of her own genitals, continues to elicit amused and dismissive responses from many historians and scholars of psychoanalysis. Wilhelm Reich does little better. An active member of the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society in the 1920s, and originally encouraged by Freud, Reich's insistence on the supremacy of libido above all other psychoanalytic concepts, his belief that full genital orgasm was the only guarantee of psychic health, and his later conviction that, with his discovery of orgone energy, he had at last identified the material expression of the libido, remain in the history of ideas controversial and dubious, if not fantastic and insane. Even Alfred Kinsey, despite his huge popular influence, is rarely taken seriously as a thinker, in large part because his commitment to empirical data registers most notoriously in his adamance that orgasm transforms sexual behaviour into a quantitative event. And I have a bit more to say about Kinsey later on. If Freud alone seems to have escaped this trivialisation, it's perhaps in part because orgasm is only rarely mentioned explicitly in his work. Several years into my project, I was already well versed in the effect the disclosure of my research topic reliably produced in contexts as various as an appearance before a university funding committee, a conversation with immigration authorities at Heathrow, true, and an interview on breakfast television. An unpredictable combination of incredulity and jollity, the precise mix of which could be tweaked up or down to indicate approval or hostility, excitement or dismissal, recognition or exclusion. Not since the late 1980s, when I worked to convince my graduate studies director of the legitimacy of a lesbian dissertation project, had I experienced research as such a volatile exercise in information management. Even so, I was unprepared for the media storm that broke in New Zealand when in 2006, as part of a 3-person research team, I was awarded a national research grant for a sexuality studies project that included a module on orgasm. Initially, the story was about perceived conflicts of interest at work in the national funding system, but from the beginning there was also prominent attention paid to the outlandishness of funding research on orgasm, and it was this angle that kept the story alive across 3 fevered weeks, drawing a range of responses from journalists and media commentators, talkback radio audiences, academics, members of parliament, and even the Prime Minister. Headlines read, $48,000 for study into fake orgasm. Grant in addition to $500,000 received by Auckland academic. Don't believe everything you read in the press. Although I hadn't anticipated the levels of public indignation over my project's funding, nor the length of time across which it would be sustained and even raised a notch or two, the various rhetorical twists given the narrative over the next few weeks were at least familiar enough to me from those skirmishes widely known as the culture wars to arrive in an impersonal register. It was all there, the gross abuse of public funds, still psychically attached to their imaginary source, as can be seen in their being frequently described as the intimately singular taxpayer's dollar. The exposure of the queer feminist agenda and its successful infiltration of the highest levels of public culture, the deterioration of cultural life such that subjects that should remain behind the quarantine of domestic privacy take centre stage, and the intellectual bankruptcy of academic work that even the most untrained member of the public can see through in a second. While I couldn't help but note the matter-of-fact aggression with which I was routinely identified as a lesbian in media contexts where that classification served automatically to discredit me, I thought I detected a different kind of feeling vibrating outward from orgasm, a word that went into gratifyingly high media use across this period. More than the usual hostility and anxieties about loss of control that customarily drive culture wars and other media panics, the dominant affect here was rather an amused contempt that anyone might think orgasm a proper object for scholarly consideration. This was common currency for most media reports during the period, but we can take as exemplary the moment when, in his weekly interview with the then Prime Minister, Helen Clark, a nationally prominent radio journalist tabled as his most damning evidence the abstract from my research proposal, to my mind the most accurate account of my project that had so far been circulated, as if it made self-evident everything that was preposterous about its having received government funding. Occupying his incomprehension, as if it were an accurate measure of the deficiencies of my project, the journalist nevertheless reinforced something for me in relation to the discursive contours of modern orgasm. It was not simply the hypocrisy of ridiculing anyone investing scholarly time and labour in a subject clearly fascinating enough to magnetise sustained media attention and public interest. More salutary was his presumption of knowingness about orgasm, and his extension of that presumption to the Prime Minister, and even beyond her to the anonymous mass of his listeners. The broadcast subtext was that there is nothing to be said about orgasm because we all know it all already. According to this logic, the scholar who attends to orgasm must somehow have missed out on what is for everyone else common knowledge, the stuff that has reached such levels of saturation that it's synonymous with the alleged banality of popular culture. And so, 20 Questions, a regular column that comments satirically on current affairs in a glossy monthly magazine, asked, "Couldn't the Marsden Fund have just bought Annamarie Jagose a copy of Cosmopolitan?" For a long while, the working title for my project was 20th Century Orgasm. And then I stepped up to the one-word super title. This title, 20th Century Orgasm, was intended as a corrective to the presumption that we know all that can be usefully known about orgasm. But during the media frenzy, through the unkind offices of those whose flaunted knowingness about orgasm functioned in part as a badge of their modernity, I saw that the rubric of 20th century orgasm simply compounded the problem it meant to address. For it could most easily be interpreted as not only distinguishing between orgasms, historical and contemporary, but also securing that distinction by reifying modern orgasm as a single, knowable phenomenon, the 20th century kind. Where previously I had counted as a successful instance of everyday pedagogy the moment when the Heathrow official had paused suspiciously with his stamp hovering over my passport to ask, "What other kind is there?" I now had to worry that I had unintentionally arrested him on his learning trajectory and perhaps even set him wrong. Contrariwise, I had intended that the phrase would function as a reminder that orgasm, as we moderns encounter it, is not a simple thing. According to this logic, 20th century orgasm would operate as a placeholder for a complex constellation of ideas that figures orgasm in diverse and often contradictory ways. In framing modern orgasm as a historical subject, I had thought to short-circuit its invocation as an ahistorical phenomenon, thereby foregrounding its specificity and distinctiveness, the unique compactions of cultural meaning that have accrued to orgasm, as well as the wide repertory of narratives that have taken orgasm as their figural vehicle across the 20th century. So as a working concept, 20th century orgasm is not intended to delimit the scholarly consideration of orgasm, but rather to draw attention to a particular instantiation of it, the roughly circumscribed moment in which orgasm emerges as a privileged figure for a sexuality concerned less with procreation, kinship ties, and patronymic lines of inheritance than with, as Michel Foucault writes, the sensations of the body, the quality of pleasures, and the nature of impressions. As a rubric, 20th century orgasm potentially unsettles the complacent, because largely ahistorical sense, that in contrast to various earlier understandings of orgasm, many of which have proved inaccurate in light of current medical and scientific knowledges, the 20th century was when orgasm shook off persistent folkloric narratives and emerged as a comprehensively investigated and transparently known phenomenon. Rather than presume that post-Kinsey, post-Height Report, post-Grafenberg spot, we know everything there is to know about orgasm, thinking critically about its centrality to the 20th century redefinition of sexuality as a means of self-realisation rooted in pleasure and unconnected to reproduction makes possible the historicisation of a bodily event all too often explained as ahistorical or natural, the allegedly unremarkable effect of biological or evolutionary drives. No matter how many orgasms I experience, viscerally or vicariously, I find it impossible to think of them, singly or collectively, as archival, as the object of my scholarly pursuit. By this I mean to suggest something of the way in which orgasm is not an eidetic phenomenon. Despite its apparent indenture to the present moment, the now of embodied experience, orgasm can seem more immediately historical or futural, hard to recall or summon in any specificity, belonging to some moment whose distance from this reflective one marks the impossibility of its full interpretive recovery. No less an observer of orgasm than Kinsey was convinced that subjective reports of orgasm were next to useless anyway, of little descriptive value, and certainly not accurate enough to be taken for scientific data. Unapprehensible at the time in any mode that might be thought scholarly, orgasm is also difficult to recreate afterwards with any specificity. It drifts just beyond the retrieval capacities of recollection, accessible perhaps only as a second-generation memory of a memory, tending not to yield itself up as an object. Perhaps this is often the way when the ephemera of everyday life are required to carry the weight of an intellectual scrutiny they can't sustain and also remain everyday. But it is also something to do with what I apprehend as the particular discursive constitution of orgasm in the long 20th century, a historical period stretching from the late 19th century with the emergence of a post-Victorian sexual modernism to the current moment, which still only thinks of itself as a new century with some self-consciousness or rhetorical verve. While the rubric of 20th century orgasm has been a handy way of broadly indicating what I'm working on, the more work there I did, the more uncertain I became about what kind of research object 20th century orgasm might be. For a humanities-based scholar like myself, what kind of thing is orgasm? In an essay called Thing Theory, which references, among other critical traditions, Martin Heidegger's thinking on things, Bill Brown, a professor of English at the University of Chicago, suggests something of the almost accidental encounter that make things perceptible to us as things. Emphasising the perspectival slant that less enables us to perceive things than bodies them forth as things, Brown notes, we don't apprehend things except partially. In fact, by looking at things, we render them objects. Turning our investigative gaze on something that has flickered beguilingly in our peripheral vision doesn't, it seems, according to Brown, give us more of the thing. Under the full frontality of our inquiry, the thing is immediately reconfigured as an object. Is this the kind of thing orgasm might be? Some sort of swiping engagement with the circumstances of one's own materiality that, on being studied closely, more likely in the lab than in the bedroom or bathhouse, closes itself off into objecthood, a specifiable hemodynamic or neurochemical event tidily housed within the universal gradations of the sexual response cycle. Thinking the thingness of orgasm, at least as it is persuasively posited in Brown's Thing Theory, holds open for me a dialectic space for conceptual trade between the literal and the figural, the concrete and the ephemeral, the immanent and the transcendent. It allows orgasm to be captured as a complex and ambivalently figured discourse effect, less in the definitive and disciplinary way that a fugitive is taken, than in the way that large data sets are imagined captured by computational processes that nevertheless can't always easily ascertain or necessarily comprehend the myriad actualities that such data might express. Thus, orgasm might be understood to figure simultaneously a number of apparently contradictory states that, far from being ordered by the neat logics of succession or even the clear-cut animosities of opposition, continue to play off each other taking on each other's coloration in sometimes unexpected ways. This is not to say that on the one hand there are the embodied realities of orgasm, and on the other its second-order figural circulations, on the one hand the event, and on the other its extrapolation into cultural meaning. Rather, it is to suggest that our understandings of 20th century orgasm, no less our fleshly experiences of it, are equally strung on the warp of figuration as the weft of literality. My emphasis here on the discursive ambivalence of orgasm is made against the common presumption that when it manifests, orgasm is an unambiguous thing in itself. Consider as exemplary in this regard the standardisation and stabilisation of orgasm in Alfred Kinsey's monumental studies, Sexual Behaviour in the Human Male, and its companion volume, unsurprisingly, Sexual Behaviour in the Human Female, both publishing landmarks for 20th century understandings of sexuality. Defining orgasm in terms of what he calls outlet, Kinsey uses its alleged stability in order to quantify sexual practice. Unless it ends in orgasm, sexual activity doesn't count for Kinsey, in the literal statistical sense, as an event. Noting the difficulty of specifying scientifically between the spheres of the erotic and the non-erotic, between, for example, the socially decorous and the libidinally passionate kiss, Kinsey insists on the material actuality of orgasm, which he describes variously as a distinct and specific phenomenon and a concrete unit. For Kinsey, orgasm makes sex countable. His dogged insistence that there is no better unit than orgasm for measuring the incidences and frequencies of sexual activity enabled him to suspend moral distinctions between different classes of sexual activity, all of which are even-handedly classified as variations of a basic sexual release. In defining orgasm as a generic and replicable unit of quantification, Kinsey was part of the long process whereby orgasm has been specified with increasing precision across the 20th century as an embodied event, temporally identified as a definite and defined period in the successive stages of the human sexual response, and particularised through such representational technologies as the electroencephalograph, the electrocardiograph, and magnetic resonance imaging. Yet the more orgasm is materialised through these various medical imaging techniques, the less recognisable it seems in relation to its everyday, non-laboratory manifestations. Made strange by the very technologies that would apprehend it more fully, orgasm can seem to refuse or slip from under the usual protocols of representation. In suggesting that orgasm resists objectification, I am of course participating in an almost equally well-worn discursive tradition that brings orgasm to figuration by insisting on its unrepresentability. This problem of unrepresentability might be conceptualised primarily as a technical difficulty, as can be seen in the literary modernist project, whose experimental interest in giving form to interiorised subjectivities often takes orgasm as its limit case. Let's take as a productive instance the often cited passage from Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, in which Mrs. Dalloway ascends the stairs to her attic bedroom on a swarm of thoughts that typify the narrative's formal innovation. Only for a moment, but it was enough. It was a sudden revelation, a tinge like a blush which one tried to check, and then as it spread, one yielded to its expansion and rushed to the furthest verge, and there quivered and felt the world come closer, swollen with some astonishing significance, some pressure of rapture which split its thin skin and gushed and poured with an extraordinary alleviation over the cracks and sores. Then for that moment she had seen an illumination, a match burning in a crocus, an inner meaning almost expressed, but the close withdrew, the hard softened, It was over, the moment. What kind of moment is this that begins as a duration, a span of time, but ends as a designation of a thing, some object or event? Evoking but never specifying its content, this passage mimics the phenomenological temporalities and carnalities of orgasm. To the extent that it could be said to describe orgasm, this passage secures its representation via an oscillation between strategies of opacity and specificity, the stream of suggestive verbs, spread, rushed, quivered, gushed, poured, scarcely able to maintain secure connection to their ungendered pronominal subjects, the described moment turning on the surreal montage of the match and the crocus, but being snuffed out before it can congeal as meaning. The narrowly technical or literal understanding of the difficulty of representing orgasm that literary modernism addresses itself to is amplified by a further contingent or strategic sense, as when feminist philosopher Elizabeth Gross meditates on what it might mean to write about orgasm. Gross writes, "Originally, I had planned to write this essay on female sexuality and particularly on female orgasm. After much hope and considerable anguish that I would be unable to evoke the languid pleasures and intense particularities of female orgasm, I abandoned this idea, partly because it seemed to me to be a project involving great disloyalty, speaking the philosophically unsayable, spilling the beans on a vast historical secret about which many men and some women have developed prurient interests, and partly because I realised that at the very most, what I write could be read largely as autobiography, as the true confessions of my own experience, and have little more than anecdotal value. I could have no guarantees that my descriptions or analyses would have relevance to other women." With some optimism and more than a little trepidation, Gross describes here the prospect of writing an essay on female orgasm. Although it gives her pause, it is not finally the literal difficulty of specifying and defining the essential characteristics of female orgasm that make her beg off her original plan. Although she considers she doesn't have the formal training for it, she remains confident that the apparently leisured rhythms of female orgasm and its peculiar distinctiveness might nevertheless be disciplined into description. It is rather for two other reasons, no less connected to the problem of representation that female orgasm constitutes, that Gross abandons her idea and turns her critical attention elsewhere. What stops the feminist philosopher in her traces is not finally a technical problem caused by the difficulty of representing orgasm, but an ethical one, attentive to the dilemmas attendant on such representation. First, she reflects that it's the historical status of female orgasm as unrepresentable, at least within certain disciplinary traditions, that means any attempt to bring it to representation collaborates with those cultural forces bent on making it yield its secret truth. According to a tactically tautological logic, by dint of being philosophically unsayable, female orgasm must remain unrepresented. Second, Gross reasons that any account she might give of female orgasm risks being received as autobiographically disclosing, a judgment she appears to second when she allows that other women may find nothing apposite in her account. Here, the intense particularities of female orgasm, in Gross's phrase, have contracted so tightly that they can suffer no generalisation whatsoever, being applicable only to the singular individual who experiences them, and therefore of little relevance to any other. Even though, in the context of Gross's argument, these 2 points are self-reinforcing, the 2 reasons she offers for her critical shift subscribe to quite different understandings of orgasm, both in prominent 20th century circulation. The distinction can be grasped most securely when it is understood that the first explanation hinges on disloyalty, the second on irrelevance. In arguing that her representation of female orgasm would constitute an act of gender treachery, Gross represents orgasm as a shared experience that is communal insofar as it binds her to the imaginary population constituted by her gender. But in arguing that it would be inconsequential, she represents it as highly particularizing and distinctive, experienced as idiosyncratic almost to the point of alienation. So if 20th century orgasm is both representable and unrepresentable, it is also and at once personal and impersonal. Yet these are only two of the many, many contradictions that structure what orgasm comes to mean in the 20th century. 20th century orgasm is also natural and cultural, innate and acquired, voluntary and involuntary, mechanistic and psychological, literal and figurative, trivial and precious, social and asocial, liberative and regulatory, worldly and out of this world, an index for autonomy and self-actualization, as well as for interpersonal and communal attachment, the epitome of erotic pleasure and its extinction, indifferent and intrinsic to taxonomic categories of sexual difference and sexual orientation. These oppositions are not entirely specific to orgasm, nor without precedent. They draw their contradictory charge from the historic processes whereby sexuality has come to constitute a framework of intelligibility for sex. Orgasm structuring contradictions, then, are evidence of their intrinsic intimacy with the epistemological contours of modern sexuality, and as such, they can't be explained away or even decisively arbitrated. So rather than resolve orgasm's semantic ambiguities, my project in orgasmology is to use its ambivalent profile to revisit issues of abiding interest for scholars of sexuality, to approach familiar questions slant. This tactic has involved seeing past the already known object or event of orgasm in order to recognise the capacity of its lateral energies to reorganise axiomatically or even complacently held knowledges about not only sex, sexual difference, and sexual orientation, but also the social contract, democracy, ethics, capitalism, modernity, affect, and history, to name only some of the big-ticket concepts that get a skewed attention in my orgasm project. Thinking about orgasm in these terms as something that can't contain itself, that articulates to scenes it seems initially to have no business with, has often worked in me a welcome everyday derangement. The longer I stuck with it as an idea, the more it seemed to me that orgasm might be one of our richer cultural repositories for thinking queerly, that is, for thinking about sex unattached to sexuality and about sexuality beyond disciplinary pragmatics. Less an organising than a disorganising principle, orgasm as a critical term is taken up but not exhausted by questions of politics and pleasure, practice and subjectivity, agency and ethics. Far from producing a cultural history of orgasm in the 20th century then, I'm interested in the ways in which 20th century orgasm can't be persuaded to pull itself together in a single authorising narrative. Given the tendency for orgasm to be conscripted by contemporary theory to any number of utopian projects, including post-orgasmic ones, I want to make clear that I'm not calling for orgasm as the grounding figure for a new political theoretical schema or a new way of inhabiting the world. At the various talks and presentations I've given while this work was in progress, one of the most common audience responses was to try and clarify with me, sometimes to try and clarify for me, how orgasm might represent a different ground for a new political engagement. But I'm not advocating for orgasm in this way. I'm not offering it as yet another critical figure around which we can rally differently than the last figure we rallied differently around. Rather, I'm speaking to the value of sticking with an unlikely scholarly object, attending to the thick textures of its discursive formulations, for the new perspectives it affords on familiar questions and even received knowledges, without requiring it to harden off into a specifiable program or course of action. The difficulty of stabilising orgasm sufficiently to get a scholarly bead on it without losing a feel for the ephemeral multivalence that makes it such a critically productive figure in the first place meant there was a stretch of time during which I feared that, contrary to the vast and ever-expanding catalogue of quasi-anthropological things about which the opposite is readily claimed, orgasm might not be good to think with. It is, however, the inchoate discursive energies of orgasm, some of which I've tried to sketch here, that guarantee its vitality as a critical term. As the title for my inaugural lecture, and similarly the title for my book, Orgasmology is intended to capitalise on the maverick energies of orgasm's various double binds. I think of orgasmology as a cusp word. Despite its relatively frequent appearance in sexological and related literatures, it's not adequately authoritative to have an entry in the OED, yet it's in possession of sufficient semantic transparency to make any dictionary consultation unnecessary. The appeal of orgasmology as a title, then, derives from the way the term is hardly able to hold itself together, threatening to come apart at the seam where unschooled orgasm tries to stitch itself up with learned ology. If orgasmology suggests that a field of knowledge might properly cohere about orgasm as a scholarly object, it also suggests that such a field is more a fantasy formation than a disciplinary one. Nevertheless, it's my hunch that the highly charged figure of 20th century orgasm might prove useful for contemporary sexuality studies. This efficacy of orgasm as a conceptual term is due not to some intrinsic quality of orgasm itself, but rather to the way in which it falls across or slips between the categories of analysis more commonly used to investigate sexuality in lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and feminist studies. As a term, orgasm lets us take a break from the critical traditions and conceptual paradigms that have patterned our understanding of sexuality, such as masculinity and femininity, heterosexuality and homosexuality, sexual identity, and sexual act. If I pursue orgasm as my organising principle here, it's not because I think a grand interventionist narrative might be founded in its name. Rather, my hunch about its conceptual efficacy derives from its very beside-the-pointness, the fact that orgasm is mostly regarded as tangential to the major structuring rubrics of sexuality studies. Again, the elasticated semantic reach of orgasmology proves useful. For even as it attests to the impossibility of orgasm constituting a field of knowledge in the traditional sense, orgasmology keeps in circulation the valuable idea that orgasm, when considered as the focus for critical inquiry, might productively ground scholarship insofar as it has the capacity to reorder axiomatic knowledges, to make a different sense of the schematic systems via which sexuality is defined and investigated. Since orgasm is neither an identity nor even an act, a consideration of 20th century orgasm as a resolutely historical formation holds open an interpretive space between sexual identity and sexual act, the coordinates that have significantly structured sexuality studies to date. Indentured to no particular sexual formation or behaviour, orgasm overrides even as it makes increasingly fine distinctions between more stable categories of sexual classification. Central to, but not definitive of, the range of practices and identities that knit up sexuality as it has come to be known, the allegedly common language of orgasm marks a productive fault line for everyday understandings of the body and sexual desire, giving rise to a different framework for thinking historically about sexual subjectivity and practice in the 20th century, and no doubt beyond.
We do have some time now for questions. If you wish to ask a question, please wait for the microphone, stand up and say your name. So are there questions? Well, can I ask one while other people are thinking about it, just before you relax?
She's already standing up.
Yes, I'm already standing up and you know who I am. It was a question about, it was the 20th century bit. You know, I'm a historian and I do chronology things. And I absolutely took your point about using the term orgasmology, not 20th century orgasm. But what I wanted, is there, are you arguing that there's a particular thing, a particular way in which orgasm is thought about, articulated, the thingness of it in the 20th century? You've written on the 18th century, for example. So it's a kind of question for me about, is there a kind of historical trajectory about how one might approach the question that you would be?
Yeah, good question. It's a good question because I have an answer. Yes, I think that is the argument of my book, that Barbara's referring to sort of an early piece I published in, 2006 or 2007, which was a reading of Cleland's Fanny Hill, the famous 18th century pornographic novel, and I won't recount the circumstances under which I was a reader of this novel, but what I was interested in thinking about was that novel has proved enormously influential readings of it for feminist understandings, particularly even of the novel form, but particularly about gendered address and so forth in the novel. And then more recently, a kind of lesbian, gay, queer study started rereading the novel for thinking about, mostly about sort of male-male sexual encounters. And what sort of really struck me was that in all these different readings that sort of started to, kind of densify, if I can just make up a word, from the sort of 1970s forward, there was always an assumption that we all knew what orgasm was in a kind of transparent, ahistorical way, even from literary scholars who were enormously careful to historicise understandings of gender, understandings of, family relations, etc., about, commerce, trade, and so forth. And so I produced a reading of that novel, which, to my mind, demonstrates the mistake of thinking that we can read in a presentist way those descriptions of orgasm. And I thought that was going to be the start of the Orgasm Project. And then it just became far too ambitious to try, as a non-historian, to kind of write a history from the 18th century forward. And so I published that independently and refocused the book project around, as I say, what I've called the long 20th century. So I'm interested in thinking about that historical shift, a sort of a post-Victorian shift which is really, for many scholars, understand that is actually the point at which sexuality is invented. Even though we have all been having sex for centuries beforehand, this is the moment of a new kind of formation where sexual practices and sexual identities emerge, and sex practices start to mean different things. They start to order people, categorise them, and so forth. I'm sure lots of people here are familiar with this argument, and others who aren't, I couldn't explain it to you in the short time available, so you just have to take it on trust that that is in fact a scholarly consensus. And so I started to think, well, what if we thought about, instead of thinking as sexuality studies has traditionally done, either around formations of masculinity and femininity, or more recently around homosexuality and even more recently heterosexuality, or the classic kind of divide, sexual identities, versus sex acts. What if you sort of threw orgasm in there as a sort of a helpfully unhelpful term that didn't line up with any of that, and so could kind of disrupt how you could think that through? And so different parts of the book make different historically grounded arguments about, for example, I make an argument in the book that fake orgasm is a new sexual practice that can only be invented in the 20th century because the conditions for it don't exist previously. So the sort of in sexuality studies, it's very common to say that there aren't really that many inventions of new sort of sexual practices. And I say, look, here's one, and I track it through a whole range of literatures to say, this kind of practice that we're sort of embarrassed about, that doesn't seem very scholarly, people don't really want to say much good things about it. Feminist theory always wants to say, it's a sort of a figure for deceitfulness or being ground down. Can't we think of that differently as a moment of innovation and experimentation, and something that arises in particular historical circumstances? the way in which marriage figures differently, in which sort of the idea that sexual pleasure will be mutual, and maybe even simultaneous in the early 20th century, and non-simultaneous in the late 20th century. That's a whole other chapter in my book, Simultaneous Orgasm, and its curious career across the 20th century. So, although not a historian, I take a very historical line on, thinking about orgasm and what it might mean for how we can think differently about a bunch of things that we usually don't think have anything to do with orgasm. So there's kind of two sides to that argument. On the one hand, I think it's very common to think now we know everything there is to know about orgasm, right? Even kids know modern subjects. This is one of our distinguishing factors. Those poor benighted people, maybe in the late 19th, early 20th century, who sort of didn't know how to have sex properly yet. And now there's us. We know the stuff, we know it scientifically, we've got a lot of evidence behind us. I wanted to say, let's think again about that. Let's think, do we really know everything there is to know about it? And on the other side, I wanted to think, once we allow that we don't know everything about it, what else does it let us know differently?
Do you see male orgasm and female orgasm as two different concepts or the same concept? I was interested in the invention of fake orgasms in this context in particular.
A very tricky specialist question. Well, you probably won't be surprised to know that I think orgasm gets figured as both of those things. At key sort of historical moments in the long 20th century, it's very important for us to think about orgasm as male and female, as gendered in particular ways, as being sort of slightly different. And now, probably much more in our contemporary moment, we understand orgasm to be sort of symmetrical for men and for women. That's kind of one of the giant sort of Kinsey, Masters and Johnson contributions to sort of produce a sort of structural shape for orgasm that is kind of similar. And in my book, I like to talk about what other kinds of ideological shifts does that map onto? What sorts of new marital models, the rise of heterosexuality as an erotic persuasion, which I think I'm arguing occurs sort of as late as the 1920s, 1930s, a little bit. Not everyone will agree with me about that, but I make an argument for that to say this doesn't just arise out of nothing, i.e. my point is you can't answer that question. There's no real answer to is there a male orgasm versus a female orgasm, or is there an orgasm that men and women have? The point is different ideological projects figure that differently, and that's kind of what I'm interested in tracking. I didn't really answer your question about simultaneous orgasm. The chapter discusses simultaneous orgasm as a indexically female practice. So my argument very much depends on it being thought of as a female practice. That's why I say it's a new kind of invention. Conferences the world over, people like to say men have fake orgasms, and I always like to say yes, but that's not the indexical instance of fake orgasm. That's not so interesting to me. I'm not disputing it. It's just doesn't seem to me characteristically the sort of gendering of the event. So.
Adrian Dickus from Asian Studies. Just extending Barbara's question, what about the non-Western orgasm? So what are the universalising claims and how do we disrupt those?
Interesting. I can't say I've done too much disruption on that front in the project. I did have at one stage kind of notes towards, this will explain to you why my project nearly drove me insane. I had a sort of a section, quite seriously substantial notes towards thinking about the contribution of orgasm as a figure for thinking about anthropological encounters between Western and non-Western cultures, particularly in sexuality studies, for example, where anthropological investigation of Papua New Guinean hill tribes were crucial to the theorisation or conceptualisation of sexual practice not indexing to identity. And then that research sort of project, which came out of sort of 1950s data, I think, was then revisited in the sort of 70s by sort of post-68 kind of more liberal sexologists who travelled back to the hill tribes to ask them much groovier questions about, not so much about sort of kinship groups and so on, but about their sort of feel, it was more like a kind of, Cleo goes back and asks questions about how did you feel about that and so forth, and then they published their, and so again I was just very interested to think through what kind of work are we expecting these certain sorts of encounters to kind of, to to make orgasm do, but perhaps quite sensibly I felt that having pranced about in a historical fashion for a while, I should probably not also indulge myself anthropologically, and I sort of didn't end up following that line of the project, but I think it would be an enormously interesting set of questions. I just guess I'm probably not the person to have pursued them in this project.
Quite interested in this universality of orgasm and how, well, balancing between having something that's completely personal and completely universal, and especially also when it comes around to the concept of realness around orgasm, that not only are we all assumed to know what an orgasm is, but we also all assume to know what a fake orgasm is. And this is not much of a question. I'm just wanting to interrogate that realness in some way.
Sure. I mean, I think in a lot of ways, particularly in our visual cultures, orgasm gets to carry a load of empirical weight around realness, perhaps sort of most recently in relation to sort of real sex cinema, a kind of arts house cinema that, accommodates sort of pornographic visual tropes. There's a sort of interesting in relation to your query. There has been some, lab-based research, which is not at all the kind of work that I do, despite speculation to this end by many media personalities, which tried to demonstrate categorically the sort of the profile of orgasm in relation to blood pressures and various other kind of physical indexes. And the research team at a certain point decided to discount certain subjects, records from the experiment because they were not convinced that they were real enough and thought that the women might have been faking. And so they produced a sort of long account and a footnote explaining that because they had taken this action, they were now fully confident that the others were kind of real. And at that point, it became seemed very unsure how that is a sort of scientific process devised to sort of say realness from fakeness. But I think at the certain point when orgasm is required to represent a whole range of social relations perhaps, and even accesses to democratic capacities and all sorts of other wider cultural realms, it's kind of natural that the question of its authenticity would come up, because if it can be faked, what does that mean for all of those other things that sort of rest uneasily on it?
Do multiple orgasms provide you with a type of historical context?
A snappy one-liner question. I think it's almost safe to say that in the book project I don't have anything to say about multiple orgasms, and despite my saying I do have, and it is true that I do have, a chapter on simultaneous and a chapter on fake orgasm, the book is not really organised around kind of types of orgasm. I'd like to say I'm sure it's not impossible to sort of mount a historical kind of argument. Even the construction of a concept of multiple orgasm, and in my understanding of it, this is a notion that develops a particular profile through Masters and Johnson primarily, and is used to differentiate female sexual experience from male. So in a historical context, I mean, I haven't done the necessary sort of, archival spade work for that, but I'm sure that you could use it to make an argument about a particular something. I guess, even though it's not really an answer to your question, one of the sustaining things about this project for me, and I guess the reason I stuck with it even while it drove me crazy, was that it took me some very unexpected places. So I never started, so that's why I hesitate to say, oh yes, if I wrote a chapter on multiple orgasm it would be about this, because actually every time I attended to something in great detail, I would turn out to make conclusions and range into fields that I really would not have expected to end up in. And I think, as I've tried to sort of outline here, that's for me one of the exciting scholarly capacities of orgasm as a figure, for me, that it does mess up our sort of received models for thinking about stuff and let us approach things in a different kind of fashion.
I'm Helen Yardley. First of all, thanks for a wonderfully structured, trenchant talk. You used the phrase loss of control. And in conjunction with your 20th century argument, would it be possible to argue that the essential universal orgasmic experience is that of loss of control, and the 20th century was basically out of control for most of it, and therefore orgasm comes into prominence. I remember W.B. Yeats's wonderful line, "The centre cannot hold. Things fall apart. The centre cannot hold." So how 20th century would a trope linking loss of control with the development of the understanding of orgasm, orgasmic haze days, the lazy, hazy days of summer, that kind of argument. Thank you.
Seems a shame to answer that question, doesn't it? It was almost turning into a dinner dance. Well, the question of control is a kind of an interesting one, because in the period in which I'm researching, orgasm is both strongly theorised, at least in kind of critical theoretical contexts, as a loss of control, particularly in sort of psychoanalytic contexts, the sense of the release of a consciousness of one's own subjective being, one of those rare kind of moments when you're not yourself in the sort of psychoanalytic sense. Your ego formations are broken down, potentially, merged with other experiences. But in that same historical period, orgasm is also associated with a highly regularised, taxonomising system of structures and plateaus and highly choreographed requirements for acquiring a set of skills, a set of physical accomplishments in order to have orgasms properly. And so once again, no surprise, you'll recognise a certain thematic similarity here. I'd probably want to suggest that orgasm is both a cipher for supreme control and lack of control. And to me, it's the way in which, as a kind of cultural figure, it shuttles between apparently sort of self-excluding or contradictory states, but manages to kind of keep them in simultaneous circulation. That makes it an interesting figure to think with.
This is Big Ideas from the ABC.